One of these two GPUs was a mistake. The 10GB RTX 3080 launched in 2020 and was generally well received, if you could find one. Just over a year later, with the GPU shortage in full effect and prices reaching the stratosphere, the 12GB version launched without an MSRP or a valid reason to exist. Now, almost 3 years later, VRAM is a hot topic in the world of PC gaming, and people are quite reasonably concerned that the original card's 10GB might not be enough anymore. Does that mean the tables have turned? It's only been a few weeks since I last tested the original 10GB RTX 3080, and the bottom line of that card is that in 2024, it's still pretty much good enough. If you want a used GPU to play games from the last 18 months at native 1440p, or higher with DLSS, there are plenty of worse ways to spend your money. Compared to the 3080 Ti, which can still command 25 to 35% more money on the used market, it's a steal. However, despite a relatively short production lifespan, the 12GB version of the plain 3080 is actually fairly common on eBay, presumably being sold off from retired Ethereum rigs. Mine cost me the same as my 10GB model did, though in fairness it's a fairly middle-of-the-road MSI version compared to the EVGA monster I bought before, and you should normally expect to pay a premium for the extra couple of gigabytes. Of course, the extra VRAM isn't the whole story. The OG version had 8,704 CUDA cores, while the newer model gains an extra 256, or just under 3%. There's also an extra 8 texture mapping units, 8 more tensor cores, and 2 more RT cores, and the VRAM is on a wider 384-bit bus, so this isn't exactly a like-for-like comparison. It is, however, the prevailing opinion that 12GB is becoming the minimum for games, so it's entirely possible that memory alone could be enough to make the 10GB version already obsolete. To find out whether the 12GB card has usurped its predecessor, I've ran both cards through my usual test suite using my usual test rig, featuring a Ryzen 5 7500F paired with some tuned DDR5 6000. Starting with the obvious, at 1080p and 1440p there's essentially no difference worth mentioning. Across the board there's no more than a single percentage point between the two GPUs in most games. Forza Horizon 5, Cyberpunk 2077, Senua's Saga Hellblade 2, Ghost of Tsushima, God of War Ragnarok, even notorious memory hog The Last of Us Part 1 don't seem to benefit from the extra VRAM at these resolutions. There are a couple of exceptions. Despite not being very memory intensive, the 12GB card does well in Starfield, and Horizon Forbidden West also seems to have a small preference for the newer variant. Also significant is Black Myth Wukong, which sees a 7 to 10% uplift moving from the old card to the new one. The other recent heavyweight, Star Wars Outlaws, proved to be something of a nightmare to benchmark on the 10GB due to all the stutters. Both of these newer titles required dropping several levels below their maximum quality presets to run well at any resolution, which could charitably be interpreted as developers making games for the future, giving players a reason to return years down the line to enjoy a new gaming experience with as yet unreleased PC hardware. Which would be all well and good, but the 3080 was the second most powerful GeForce card just one hardware generation ago, and I'd have hoped for more than a solid 1080p 60. So far, the argument for the 12GB model isn't a very strong one. Perhaps there'll be more of a difference at 4. As I said, the RTX 3080 was, for a few months at least, the second most powerful GPU in the GeForce lineup, second to the 3090, and only slightly eclipsed by the later 3080 Ti. It wasn't unreasonable to expect it to play games at 4K 60 or higher in 2020 or 2021, as I found in Forza Horizon 5. This is a perfectly acceptable 60+ experience regardless of the version of 3080 being used, without even needing to use DLSS. Cyberpunk 2077, meanwhile, would benefit from perhaps turning to DLSS balanced, as without it you can only really expect a 30 to 40 FPS experience at ultra quality. Newer titles vary somewhat. Ratchet & Clank is a little more performant than Cyberpunk, but still short of 60 FPS. Starfield could be a very smooth 30 FPS, which, if I recall correctly, is what the Xbox version was originally designed for. Alan Wake 2 dips below the 30 mark on both cards, so reduced settings or added DLSS would be recommended. And the other PlayStation ports all fall somewhere in the 40 to 50 FPS range, so whether you reach for the upscaler depends very much on how you feel about gaming below 60 FPS. What doesn't come across in any of these games is an appreciable difference between the 10 and 12GB cards. In fact, only a few games benefited from the extra memory even at 4K. The Last of Us gave a memory warning in the settings menu when using the 10GB card, and I dare say if I'd played for long enough I'd have seen more major issues. However, in my roughly 5-minute test run, both cards are as unpleasant to play as each other at these settings, and I'd say neither of them should be running at them. Resident Evil 4's max quality preset enables RT and puts textures to the 8GB setting, which is far above what these cards can handle. While there's barely any performance difference between the cards, there might be a quality difference. The 12GB card could be used at the 3GB texture setting on all three resolutions and still remain within the yellow zone. The 10GB card required dropping to 1GB to stay there, and my personal experience of this game is that you really don't want to test that red zone. Black Myth Wukong sees a 6.5 frame gap between the two cards, which is proportionately quite a lot bigger than the gap at 1080p or 1440p, and is probably the only real compelling result in favour of the 12GB model. However, all of this is ignoring the elephant in the room. Since the launch of the first RTX 3080, hardware ray tracing has become far more common and is even more demanding on VRAM than regular rendering. As RTX is right there in the name, I couldn't exactly skip it, so I ran both cards through a few of the tests from the RTX anniversary video. Cyberpunk doesn't show any appreciable difference in performance between the two 3080s. At 4K, simply enabling
medium
RT sees the 12GB card eclipsing the 10GB, and this carries on right the way up to RT Ultra. However, neither card could complete the benchmark run in overdrive. That might sound like a win for the 12GB card, but in both cases it will be necessary to use DLSS to actually get a playable result, and doing so brings us back to square one, even at 4K. Ratchet & Clank is interesting to look at because ray tracing really shows how memory intensive it can be. Again, neither 3080 really has the performance to run at full 1440 or 2160 with RT maxed out. However, this time enabling DLSS still shows a marked FPS difference between the 10 and 12GB cards. This is just academic, of course. DLSS Ultra performance glitches all over the place in this game, so you shouldn't use it in any circumstances. I've included Alan Wake 2 as a counterexample. Despite being a showcase for how little regard developers would have for older systems going forwards, it's actually not all that heavy on VRAM. Regardless of resolution or how much RT is enabled, there's only minor differences between the two cards. Even at 4K, with path tracing turned on, both the 10 and 12GB versions are equally unplayable. And, with an obscene amount of DLSS to make them playable, they maintain close enough frame rates to be essentially even. Black Myth Wukong has given the edge to the 12GB card in regular rendering, but it looks like that might just be because it prefers the extra CUDA cores. Enabling the full RT mode is the great leveler, bringing the two 3080s essentially neck and neck at every tested setting and resolution. They only pull apart at the very highest setting. The 12GB card can produce a whopping 7 FPS at 4K with max ray tracing, whereas the 10GB card scores a big fat 0. I gathered data for Star Wars Outlaws at various resolutions and levels of RTX DI, but it's all fairly meaningless. Beyond a certain point, performance becomes extremely erratic, and parts of the environment stop loading in. Even at lower settings I found that simply sprinting could make the game unplayable. Again, it's fairly academic. Outlaws is a notable flop from Ubisoft, and it's made using their in-house Snowdrop engine. So, aside from the forthcoming Assassin's Creed Shadows, we might not have anything else to look forward to based on that engine, if the company even lasts that long. As far as performance is concerned, the only way I could find of separating the RTX 3080 10GB from the 12 was to see if I could break them. If I push them both to resolutions and quality settings they simply aren't capable of running, the winner on paper is the one that produces a result at all, however terrible it might be. Frankly, in most cases, the 10GB card still passes, as once you enable DLSS to bring those unplayable settings and resolutions back to playability, suddenly both cards are viable again. If you don't want to try and push these cards beyond their capabilities, and instead are just looking for a decent value used card for gaming, the net average FPS benefit from the 12GB version over the 10GB was 2.42%. Based on these numbers, if you could get a 10GB card for, say, $350, you probably shouldn't pay more than $360 for the 12GB. Now, performance might be the be-all and end-all for PC gamers, and I understand why, but if performance isn't enough to justify the 12GB graphics card, perhaps something else will be. To see if image quality could be a deciding factor, I went back through a few titles at what I found to be the highest playable settings. We've already established there'll be a quality difference between the two cards in Resident Evil 4. The game is best run at the 3GB texture setting on the 12GB card and 1GB on the 10GB card. But does that mean anything? Well, yeah, kinda. With the 1GB texture selected, it's possible to see some surfaces that are a bit on the blurry, low-res side. In some specific instances, it's possible to see the game switching between low and high-res versions of a texture as it becomes disoccluded, or when something else moves away from being in front of them. The 3GB setting didn't show any such issues, and while you can try and run the 10GB card at that setting, it does run the risk of having the game crash, so I guess that's one scenario that actually does benefit from the 12GB card in a tangible way. Yeah, I know, it's a bit of a stretch. Forza Horizon 5 doesn't have anything so gauche as a VRAM indicator. It simply stops gameplay to warn you when you're running low on video memory, which can be incredibly annoying when it happens. At 4K Extreme with maximum ray tracing, it only took a few minutes of gameplay on the 10GB card before the warning came up, and normally if that happened to me I'd probably just jump into the menu and turn on DLSS. However, the 12GB card didn't seem to have any issues at full 4K, either during an endurance race or just a half hour or so's worth of open world gameplay. That being said, I ran the 10GB card for a similar amount of time, and I didn't see any issues either, despite the warning. When the game runs out of VRAM, it sometimes appears as parts of the road turning black, or patches of the landscape flickering on and off, and I didn't see that during my gameplay. Again, I think DLSS is the quick and dirty answer, but if you really need to find reasons to own the 12GB card, here's another one. Cyberpunk uses aggressive LOD scaling to help keep VRAM under control. You've all seen the memes from the PS4 version, I'm sure. You're not going to get any kind of that trouble from these cards. I tried out at 1440p with the RT Ultra preset, and from what I can tell, pop-in remains at about the same distance while driving, and I didn't notice any nightmarish low-poly creatures among the crowds in the city centre either. So I think owners of the 10GB card are probably safe. When it first launched, the PC port of The Last of Us was renowned for mishandling VRAM, and I'm sure people with 10GB cards in early 2023 didn't enjoy such good image quality at the time. However, a year is a long time, and most of the issues have been addressed. Even at 4K Ultra, with the menu screaming that it doesn't have enough VRAM, the image from the 10GB card looks identical to the 12GB one to my eye. Black Myth Wukong has a bit of an issue with shadow resolutions. I did most of my benchmarking at the high preset, as in my opinion that seems to be the best choice for these GPUs, but the benchmark run shows the shadow issue quite clearly. Turning up to very high doesn't help, though it does a better job of rendering ground details, which can also be a bit rubbish at high, and having 2GB more VRAM on board doesn't seem to help either. The real solution, sadly, is full ray tracing. I say sadly because the medium preset is the best choice for balancing quality and performance, and even at 1080p you'll need to use DLSS to get to 60fps. While walking through Bright Falls, I noticed there's one clear place where pop-in occurs in Alan Wake 2. These fence panels switch from low to high quality models as Agent Anderson walks along, and from what I can tell, at least by eye, they occur at the same distance regardless of the 10 or 12GB 3080. Aside from that, there are no obvious instances of the older card resorting to low quality assets when the new card would use a higher one. Perhaps not all that surprising given that the game's only using about 9GB of VRAM. Finally, I did spot one particularly glaring issue in Star Wars Outlaws. After running around the indoor area for a while at 4K high without RTX Di, I noticed that the 10GB card was suffering from disappearing floor tiles. I didn't notice this problem with the 12GB card, however there were still occasions on both cards where the game slows to a crawl. There are, in one or two games, instances where the 12GB RTX 3080 shows its worth over the 10GB version. However, they're almost always meaningless. Usually it's because the game's running at too high a resolution or quality level for the GPU, or RT is enabled and DLSS isn't. Often the problem could be resolved simply by dropping some settings. If you're shopping for an RTX 3080 in 2024 and beyond, the 12GB card might be the wisest purchase, but it's also not really worth any more money than the 10GB card. The benefits of having more memory are for your own peace of mind, to make you feel more confident that future games won't have the same issues as titles like Star Wars Outlaws. And if you want that peace of mind, honestly, I don't think you should be looking at 12GB cards either. I started the video by saying that one of the two 3080s was a mistake. And I think the answer is the same as it was 2.5 years ago. The 12GB card filled a gap that wasn't really there between the 10GB 3080 and the 12GB 3080 Ti. The 12GB 3080 had no real reason to exist in January 2022, and there's no good reason to pay over the odds for one now. So then, you might well ask why I bought one, considering I already had the 10GB card. And the answer is, I f***ed up. I bought the 3080 to put in a console killer build, which is coming in a few weeks' time. However, the EVGA card didn't actually fit inside the case. That card's going on eBay now, but before I put it up for sale, I thought I'd do this comparison in the meantime. Thanks for watching, kindly do the usual YouTube things if you feel so inclined, and I'll see you next time.